Aloha and welcome to our video on the organ systems. Today we will list the organ systems in the body and also will describe how the integumentary system contributes to homeostasis. Now we've seen this before, but the organization of the human body by levels. And when we look at this, what we're talking about is starting off with a cell, and then if we have a bunch of cells working together, we end up with a tissue. When we have a bunch of tissues working together, we end up with an organ, and we get a bunch of organs working together, we end up with an organ system. We add a bunch of organ systems, and that makes the organisms. We can see how all of these kind of interrelate and are related to each other. As a quick review of all of the different systems that we'll be covering in this unit, let's go through them real quickly. First up is the integumentary system. Quite simply, that's going to be the skin, our sweat glands, and our hair. It helps regulate body temperature, it helps us remove some waste, but mainly it protects the body from foreign invasion. Next up is the skeletal system, made of bones, cartilage, and ligaments. The skeletal system protects internal organs, provides our structure and shape, and allows for movement. It also is an area where we can store minerals and produces our blood cells. In the muscular system, which is made of muscles and tendons, this is what provides voluntary and involuntary movement. Without the muscles, we would just kind of lay around and do nothing. It takes the muscles to make movement happen. The digestive system consists of the mouth, esophagus, stomach, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, intestines, rectum, and anus, and it's for breaking down food. It also is where we absorb the water and the nutrients we get from the food, and it's important in the elimination of wastes. Moving on to the respiratory system, which is the lungs, pharynx, larynx, bronchus, alveoli, bronchiolae, and the diaphragm. This is how we take oxygen into the body, which we use for cellular respiration, and it's how we get rid of carbon dioxide, the waste product of cellular respiration. Up next is the circulatory system, made of the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood itself. And the main function of the circulatory system is to transport gases and nutrients throughout the body. It also helps carry away waste materials from the cells. Next up, the nervous system, made of the brain, spinal cord, neurons, and sense organs. This is what coordinates and controls body movements and responses. This is what makes sure we're doing what we need to be doing. It also serves as a communication network for the body. The endocrine system is made up of a bunch of different glands. We won't go over those now, we'll go over those a little bit later on, but these glands produce hormones which help regulate body functions. The excretory system is made up of the kidneys, the urinary bladder, the ureters, and the urethra, and this is what regulates water balance in the body. It also is important in removing wastes from the body as well. We also have the immune and lymph systems made of the spleen, thymus, lymph nodes, and the white blood cells, and these are what protects the body from diseases by fighting infections. And finally, that brings us to the reproductive system. Once again, we're seeing a bunch of different structures, which we'll cover later on, but primary function of the reproduction system is to create sperm and eggs, and then to protect and nourish a developing embryo inside of a female. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a deeper look into the integumentary system. The integumentary system, you can see here by this cross section, is basically where the skin is and the things that are associated with the skin. We have three different layers of the integumentary system. The epidermis is the outer layer, and that one offers primarily protection for things coming in. It keeps things from getting into our body, like pathogens, diseases, illnesses, things like that. It keeps a barrier from us and the rest of the world. The middle layer is the dermis. In the dermis is where we have all of our extra things in the skin, like our oil glands, our hair follicles, our sweat glands, things of that nature. That's where it's kept. And then below that is the fatty layer, and the fatty layer is quite simply an insulation. It helps regulate body temperature, so it's important in the role of homeostasis, because what it'll do is it'll trap our heat inside of us when it's colder outside, or it'll keep the heat and the cold outside of the body, and it allows us to keep our body in a nice normal temperature that allows all of the reactions that we need to live happen. So these are the three layers of the system, and we can see some of the things that are in there as well. The hair is included in this system here, and the hair pole is an interesting thing, somewhat sensory. We can kind of tell when we bump things with the hair, like whiskers and things of that nature, but also it helps create this pocket of air above. So when it's cold and you get goosebumps and your hair stands up, what it's doing is it's trapping that air, and then we heat up that air and it kind of works like an air blanket to keep us warm. When you get scared and you get goosebumps, again, it's just going to be a little more sensory so you can feel if something touches it. Okay, so if we take a look at the system here, you can see that it's basically the skin that we have. It's made up of skin, made up of the hair, which we talked about, and it's also made up of sweat glands. And sweat glands are important because what that does is it'll put a layer of water on our body, and when that water evaporates, it'll pull the heat from our body, and that's how we cool. So that's why you get sweaty when it's hot outside or if you're doing a lot of activity. So, as we mentioned, the function of the integumentary is to regulate body temperature, and that's done with the sweating, with the hair, with the fatty layer. All of those things help regulate our body temperature, keep it to where it needs to be in that homeostatic condition so that all of our reactions can work and function. It also removes waste. We can sweat out some things that way, and then it also protects the body by forming a barrier between us and the environment that doesn't allow things in. Okay, so that's it for this video. I know there's an awful lot here, but this is kind of an introductory to all the systems. Good luck with your lessons, and as always, we'll see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to our video on the skeletal and muscular systems. We're going to identify the functions of bones, and we'll also talk about different kinds of muscles in this video today. So let's take a real quick overview look of the skeletal system. If you notice, there's a couple bones and things. They serve different purposes. We have our bones for movement, which are going to be the long bones, like the ones here in the legs and the arms. But we also have bones for protection, like the skull, which protects the brain, the ribs here, which are going to protect our heart and lungs, and then the pelvis, which will protect some of the lower organs, especially those involved in reproduction. So we can see that they have different functions. Because of the bones, it gives the muscles something to work against, so that allows us to move. Okay, so let's focus again a little bit more on the functions of the skeletal system. So first and foremost, it protects the organs. So as we mentioned, the rib cage protects the heart and the lungs, the vertebra protects the spinal cord, the pelvis protects the reproductive organs, and then the skull is going to protect the brain. And these are going to be bones that will like wrap around that structure and provide protection against it. It's also what gives the body shape. Remember, bones are the framework that support the softer tissues. Most of the body is going to be soft tissues, so we'd be a lump without the bones. The bones give us our shape. They also allow for movement because that's what the muscles are attached to. So when the muscles move, the bones move, and since the bones give us our shape, that's what allows us to move. It's also where we form blood cells. Bones contain the red marrow, and in the red marrow, it has special cells that make blood cells. So our red blood cells are actually made in the bones. And then finally, we can use the bones to store some minerals. So they'll store calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium. When we have that in our diet, it gets stored into the bone, and that's kind of like a bank where it keeps it. If we're not getting enough of these things in our diet, then what it does is it pulls these nutrients out. So you'll hear about things like osteoporosis, and that's when you're older and you're not able to store the calcium. Your body will take the calcium out of the bones, and that'll make your bones a little more brittle. Now, the skeletal system includes bones and cartilage. Cartilage, if we can see right here, is this kind of soft, squishy material. It's in a lot of the joints where it'll provide a little bit of cushion for the bones to rub up against. So it's not like a hard-to-hard surface. There's kind of like something soft there for it. It's also, we have elastic cartilage, which gives us the shape of our ear and our nose. In our throat, we have cartilage, which protects our airways. And then this one down here on the rib cage is kind of important because when we breathe, our rib cage needs to expand a little bit. And if it was all bone, it wouldn't be able to do that. So having that cartilage helps it do that one as well. When we look inside of a bone, we were talking about the red marrow here where we see a lot of the production of blood cells. And you can see there's several different layers to the bones. We have the outsides, insides where it's going to be compact, spongy on the inside, and the marrow deep inside. There's blood vessels that run through it because the bones are alive. It's not just a dead structure, there's living cells in there. Okay, so we talked about bones being allowing us to move. For that to happen, our bones can't be one single solid piece. They have to be various pieces, and they have to be able to interact with each other. And these points of interaction are what we call the joints. There's several different kinds of joints that we have in our body. We have a hinge joint like our knee, which is where we have bones that come together, and they move primarily in just like one direction, like a hinge on a door. And we can see that range of motion primarily here. We also have the ball and socket joints like in our shoulder, and that allows for a lot more movement. We also have those in our hips, and that gives us our arms. It's a full range of motion that we have. We have gliding joints in our wrists, and that allows for a free range of motion as well, and a little bit of different ones from our shoulder. And then we have pivot joints right here, which allow us to turn our head back and forth, side to side. So a couple other things I want to show you. If we take a look at our knee over here, which is a hinge joint, we have a couple different things. We have ligaments that we've talked about briefly, and they'll talk about those in the lesson, but that'll connect bone to bone. So you can see that this one here is going to connect these two bones right along here. We also have tendons, which we'll talk a little bit here in a minute when we talk about the muscles, but that connects the muscle to the bone. So we have tendons and ligaments there. We talked about having the cartilage that we have here as well that allow the bones to interact with each other, but they're not grating and grinding upon each other that way. Okay, so let's do a real quick summarize of the skeletal system. Remember that it's made up of our bones, cartilage, and ligaments. And the functions for the skeletal system are to protect organs, provide structure and shape, give us the ability to move. We can store minerals in them, and they produce our red blood cells. So that's our quick introduction of the skeletal system. Now, moving on to the muscular system, we can see that there are a bunch of different muscles in the body. We're not going to go over a whole bunch of them. I'm not expecting you to memorize all of them. This is just kind of so you can see where they are. And we'll talk about the muscles a little bit more here as we progress forward. Now, one of the things about muscles you want to make sure you know is that most of our paired muscles work in antagonistic pairs, which means they're working against each other. In the example we have here, we have our biceps and we have our triceps. Both of these are the muscles of the upper arm. We have the biceps, which is going to be here, and when the biceps flex, which means they contract, they're going to get shorter. It's going to pull the lower arm up towards the shoulder. So that's how we raise our hands up, is using the biceps. Now our triceps are going to be relaxed when this is happening, and the reason being is when our triceps contract and our biceps relax, then what that's going to do is that's going to pull on the back side of the arm, and that's going to extend the arm outwards. So by those working together in opposition of each other, that's why we can raise our hand and push our hand away. So it kind of works that system. That's what we're talking about antagonistic, is that they're working against each other for the common good here. Now we do have three different types of muscle in the body. The first one is the cardiac muscle, and cardiac, it hints here what it is. Cardiac muscle is going to be found in the heart, and it's going to be a muscle that's just designed to work and work and work and work and work. It's always working that way. We don't have any control over it. It's autonomic, so it's just going to continuously beat, and that's what it's for. It's so that the heart will continuously beat, and that's what lets us have a heartbeat and live. Next up, we have skeletal muscles, and skeletal muscles we have control over. These are the ones we'll find, like we talked about, in our bicep and things like that. These are what allow us to move, and we have control over the skeletal muscles with our nervous system. And then finally, we have smooth muscles here, and most of our smooth muscles are going to be the lining of our digestive system. And what that does is that's what allows the food, it's by peristalsis and wave-like motions, and it'll push the food through the digestive system for us. So 3 different kinds of muscle cells. They all serve a slightly different purpose. We have control over one of them. The rest of them are going to be autonomic, and they just kind of work and do their job as they're supposed to without us having to think about it. Okay, so as a quick review of the muscular system, let's go through its structures real fast. We talked about muscles and how there's 3 types. We also mentioned tendons briefly. Tendons are what attaches the muscles to the bones so that they're able to move the bones and it works. Now, the purpose for the muscular system is movement. Okay, without them, we wouldn't be able to move, and that's what it does. It'll produce voluntary movement like our skeletal muscles do, or involuntary movement like our heart and our smooth muscles of our digestive system. Okay, well, that's it for this video. As always, good luck in the lessons. They'll go into a lot more detail there for you, and we will see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to our video on the digestive system. Our goals for the video are to trace the path of food through the digestive system, and we'll have a short little talk about glycogen. Okay, so let's talk about the digestive system. In the digestive system, there's four basic processes that happen. We start with ingestion, then we go through what we call digestion, then we go through absorption, and we end up with elimination. The ingestion part is how we get food into the system. And primarily, ingestion is going to work through the mouth and the esophagus. So we'll take the food, put it in the mouth. Within the mouth, several things happen. We have teeth that'll break it down into smaller pieces. We have saliva that has a couple digestive enzymes in them, so it'll start breaking the food down. But more so, it makes it kind of like a wet, pasty substance that makes it easier to transfer through the digestive system. You won't want to put through a bunch of different solid pieces. You kind of want to grind it up a little bit and make it, and that's what the ingestion part does. Next up is the process of digestion, and this is where we're breaking down the food. A lot of that will happen here in the stomach, and in the stomach is where we add stomach acid, some more enzymes. It kind of gurgles and churns and bubbles and boils and all that kind of fun stuff in your stomach, and it makes it into this chyme substance, this like liquidy, soupy, nutrient-rich soup that's going to go through. There's a little bit of digestion that occurs in the intestines as well. And then also we're going to get some materials from the gallbladder, the liver, and the pancreas that are going to aid in this digestion. Some more of the enzymes and digestive juices, so to speak. Okay, so now that we have all of this nutrients that have been digested and broken down into smaller bits and pieces, we need to get it into the body. And that's what the absorption part is. Now, absorption is going to happen in the intestines for the most part. The small intestine generally takes out a little bit more in the nutrients. The large intestine is going to be a little bit more of recovering last minute nutrients, but also water. So all of the water that we've added to our food to digest it, we try and extract that water back out. So that's the purpose of absorption. It's trying to get the stuff into the body. And that leads us to the last stage, which is the elimination stage. The elimination stage deals with just the last two pieces. The rectum is where it's going to store the food and again try and extract out that last bit of water that it can, and then it gets rid of the food through the anus. And what you notice is it's a one-way system. So we put food into the mouth, it progresses through the digestive system, goes through all the steps, and then comes back out that way. So it's really an interesting way that the system works. We take the food, break it up, make it into a soupy-like structure, digest out, get all the nutrients out that we can, absorb those into the body, and then get rid of the waste products. Okay, so let's review the digestive system real quickly. Remember, there are four different phases to the digestive system. The first was ingestion, and ingestion is where we're breaking down food. We're entering it in through the mouth, it goes through the esophagus there, and it's just basically how we get the food into the system. Next up was the digestive phase, and that's the further breaking down. This is where we're adding chemicals and kind of churning it in the stomach. The chemicals come from the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, and a little bit from the small intestine, but this is where we're breaking those molecules down into usable products. We then get to the absorption part here, and in the absorption occurs in the intestines, and that's where we're going to be taking out the water and the nutrients from this like digested sludge of the food that we've eaten per se. And that leads us to the elimination phase, and that comes through where we store the food in the rectum and then expel it out through the anus. So what you can see is we have our four different processes of the digestive system. So the ingestion part, the digestive, the absorption, and the elimination. And it's a one-way system like we mentioned. So it starts in the mouth, ends in the anus. We put the food in, take the wastes out, and we absorb whatever we can during the process of it. Okay, the last topic I want to talk to you about in today's video is going to be glycogen here. Glycogen is a polymer, so that means it's a large molecule. It's made up of a bunch of smaller molecules called monomers, and in the case of glycogen, the monomer, the building blocks for it is going to be glucose. And if you can recall, glucose is what the cells use in cellular respiration to produce ATP, which is what our cells use for energy. So there's a couple different things with this glycogen I want to show you. First, we have this ingestion into the body, and we'll take it in through starch, glycogen itself, disaccharides, and monosaccharides, basically the sugars. We get the sugars inside of our body. Then we will distribute and utilize what we can. So through the digestive system, we'll absorb these sugars, and the circulatory system will send it out to the cells, and whatever we can use, we use. And this is going to be primarily broken down into just glucose molecules. If there's extra, then we store it in the body as glycogen. And you can see a molecule here of what it looks like. It's just this knotted mess of glucose molecules together. It's a large molecule, but it stores a lot of glucose together, keeps it together that way for us. So glycogen is how we store extra glucose in the body for use later on. Okay, well that's it for our video. As always, good luck on the lessons, and we'll see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to the video on the respiratory system. Our goals for the video are to describe the process of gas exchange in the lungs. We'll also describe the process of breathing, and we'll list some of the respiratory diseases. Okay, so here is our respiratory system. And what we have is we start off with air coming into us and enters into the pharynx. It then enters into the larynx, which is our voice box, and then goes down the trachea and into the bronchus, which eventually forms the lungs here. So we can kind of see where that's at. Notice the esophagus from the digestive system is here as well. So we have air and food passing through the same things. The glottis is the opening of the respiratory system, and there's a little flap of skin called the epiglottis, which when food enters or water enters, it closes the airways so we don't get water and food into our lungs. Now in the lungs, we see this breaking of this air tube, this trachea here. It's going to come down and it's going to break into these ever smaller itty bitty little pieces. It'll break down into bronchiolia and eventually into the alveolus, which is a small little air sac. And we'll show you that one in the next slide. The other part of the respiratory system I want you to be aware of is this guy right here, the diaphragm. And that's a strong muscle here. And that's what actually allows us to breathe. And we'll talk about that in a couple slides as well. Now the purpose of the respiratory system is for gas exchange to occur. So what we noticed is we have this hollow tube that enters into our body. It goes all the way down to the bronchioli and then it enters into the alveoli. The alveoli are these large collections of alveolus, which is a single sac-like structure. And what happens is the air enters into that, and these alveolus are then covered in capillaries. So we see an awful lot of blood vessels right there. And the blood vessels you can kind of see lie right up on the border here. And in these blood vessels, when we have an abundance of oxygen in the alveolus, the oxygen is going to go into the blood cells and it'll attach to the hemoglobin on a blood cell. When they do this, we'll notice that there's more carbon dioxide in the blood. That carbon dioxide is going to flow out into the alveolus, and then when we exhale out that CO2. So this is how we get this blood exchange. We create this very thin barrier here, which allows the normal concentration. The oxygen is going to be more in the air. It's going to drive into the cells. The carbon dioxide in the cells is going to be more than the air. It's going to flow outwards that way, and that's how we make this switch occur. Okay, so let's talk about how it is that we actually are able to breathe. As we mentioned earlier, we have this muscle down here called the diaphragm. And when the diaphragm contracts, what it does is it extends down this way into the gut. So when you breathe in, you'll notice that your stomach area, your guts will kind of like extend out a little bit. And that's because the diaphragm is pushing down on those. But as it pushes down on those and the rib cage rises a little bit, it creates this empty space here. And that allows the lungs to expand. And when the lungs expand, it pulls air into them that way. Now the opposite is when you exhale. When you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes and it's going to go up this way. The rib cage is going to lower down a little bit. It makes this area in here a little bit smaller. So the lungs are going to get a little bit smaller, and that'll actually push the air outwards. So when you inhale, your diaphragm contracts. It makes this area larger and air flows in. When you exhale, your diaphragm relaxes. It makes this area smaller and the air rushes out. And that's how we breathe. Okay, let's talk real quickly about a couple of respiratory system diseases. Asthma is when we have an irritated airway, and what happens is normally you can see this here, there's a wide opening, so our airways are wide and constricted. With asthma, what happens is we get irritated and there's inflammation inside of it, and instead of it being a large opening, it gets to be a smaller and smaller opening, and what we notice is it's harder to breathe through that. You have to pull the air through a little bit harder, so you're not breathing as easily as you normally do. Something similar to that is bronchitis. We have our bronchitis here, but with bronchitis, instead of it being irritated, instead what we notice is we have mucus starting to fill in here. And as that mucus fills in here, it's that same result. It's going to fill in and it's going to make the airway a little bit smaller, so breathing gets a little bit harder that way. Close to bronchitis, we have pneumonia. And pneumonia, if you recall back, we have these little sacs called the alveoli. And in pneumonia, they'll fill up or they'll get some fluid inside of them. So what that means is there's now this fluid that our oxygen is going to have to transfer through to get to the blood that way. So it kind of makes it more difficult to breathe as well. Emphysema is going to be where these actual sacs break apart. And you can see it really clearly down here. And what that means is now we have less surface area. So again, there's less areas where we can breathe with. So it's like having a smaller lung per se. And then finally we get to lung cancer. And lung cancer is where we have this tumor going in, and that's just going to take away part of the lung. So it makes it harder to breathe. So all of the respiratory diseases makes it harder for us to breathe or makes it less effective when we do breathe. And that's what the problem is then we no longer have the gas exchange, and that affects the rest of the body that way. Okay, so in summary of the respiratory system, the function is to take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. Real simple function, that's what we do breathe for. The structures, we have the lungs, the pharynx, the larynx, the bronchioles, the alveoli, and the bronchiole. And then remember we talked about that muscular diaphragm that allows us to breathe. Okay, so that's it for the respiratory system. Good luck with the lessons, and we'll see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to our video on the circulatory system. In this video, we'll identify the major parts of the circulatory system and their functions. We'll also describe the parts of the blood and explain what the blood does, and we'll identify some of the causes of cardiovascular disease. Okay, so to begin, here's a picture of the circulatory system, and you can see all of its various components. Primary to it is the heart, and you can see it here in both pictures. What the heart does is the heart is the pump for the blood. It's what moves the blood through, and that's what the circulatory system needs to do. It needs to move this blood, and then the blood functions to take certain things here and there and everywhere. If you notice in this side over here is where we have our arteries. Arteries are generally those vessels that are going to go from the heart out to the body, and then we have the veins over on this side here, which return blood to the heart so it can be pumped out again. Okay, so here we have our heart, and there's a bunch of different things. Let's talk about blood flowing into the heart, and let's go from the body first. So we have this vein here, which is the superior vena cava, and the inferior vena cava down here. The superior vena cava drains the upper body, the inferior drains the lower body, and all of this blood from the body flows into here, the right atrium. From the right atrium, it's going to flow down through a valve into the right ventricle, and the right ventricle is going to pump the blood out. So it's going to pump it out here to these arteries that are going to go to the lungs, and you'll notice that this blood coming in here is coming from the body, so it's going to be high in CO2. It's going to be carrying out the waste products from cellular respiration. So we're going to send this high CO2 blood to the lungs, and in the lungs, that CO2 is going to swap out and be replaced with oxygenated blood. So the oxygen is going to swap the place of the CO2. So now we get blood high in oxygen here, which will flow into the left atrium down here. And from the left atrium, it flows into the left ventricle, which is the biggest, most muscular part of the heart. And it has to be this way because blood here will then get forced out through the aorta, and that's what takes it out to the body. So from the aorta, it branches out to go up to the head and down to the lower parts of the body. And it'll go out to the body where it has this oxygenated blood, which will give the cells the oxygen they need for cellular respiration, and it'll also carry away the waste product of CO2, which then in turn comes back here. So we can see that it's this big system. So let's take a peek here at the system real fast. And here we can see it. And we have two primarily different systems. We have the systemic system, which is here, and then we have the pulmonary system here. The pulmonary system deals with the lungs, and this is how we get our blood to and from the lungs. And you'll notice here that we go out of the right ventricle through the pulmonary artery to the lungs, and in the lungs it swaps over and becomes oxygen rich, and it'll come into the left atrium. And there it enters the systemic system, which goes to the body. And in the systemic system, it flows down into the left ventricle, out through the aorta, and then it'll go to the various parts of the body. okay? And where it goes to the capillaries, where the cells can get the oxygen from the blood, have cellular respiration occur, and they get rid of their carbon dioxide, and we have this come back, and that's what flows into the right atria. And then the right atria will flow into the right ventricle, and the whole process starts all over again. So the atria are going to be where it receives it, the ventricles where it's going to send it out. Systemic system is where it goes to the body, and the pulmonary system is where it goes to the lungs. And what it's going to do is, if we draw it here real quickly, take one blood molecule, we'll start it here in our right ventricle. We notice that that one's going to go to the lungs, come back into the left atria, to the left ventricle, out through the aorta, to the body, back into the right atria. The right ventricle go back out to the lungs, come back into the left side of the heart, back out, and it'll come back, and you can see this process, this cycle going all over again. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the blood that flows through this system. The liquid part is called plasma, and that just kind of holds the blood cells and allows them to flow through the arteries and veins. When we're talking about the solid part of the blood, we have three different things. We have our red blood cells, which are the erythrocytes, and these are the ones that have the hemoglobin in them, and those are the ones that transport oxygen out to the cells. So very important that way. In our blood, we also have the white blood cells, and the white blood cells fight infection. And they don't naturally go into the cell, they stay in this interstitial fluid. So when you have two cells that are next to each other, they're not necessarily touching, they kind of stick together, but there's a gap in between. This is the interstitial space or interstitial fluid, and that's where our white blood cells tend to hang out. But they'll travel through the circulatory system to where their infection is that they need to work on. And then finally, we have our platelets. And our platelets are made up of fibrinogen, and basically what they do is whenever there's an opening in the system, it's the platelets that'll go over there and they start blocking that off, and that's what helps form a blood clot. So that's what'll stop leakage from the circulatory system, are these platelets. And those are our components of the blood and what they basically do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some heart diseases that are going to happen. What happens is we'll have this plaque buildup in the cell wall. So other things in the blood that are going there that don't belong there, sometimes they'll find a little tear and nick or something, they'll start building up and they'll build up. And what we notice is they get to the point that they start to conflict blood flow. So when you stop blood flow like that, then several things will happen. That's when we can have a stroke, that's when we can have a heart attack, because the blood's no longer able to flow through there. It'll treat it as an opening, and sometimes we'll form a clot, and that clot can then flow, break free, blood will flow again, but now we have a clot that can get trapped in a smaller blood vessel. And this is what happens with heart attacks. A heart attack is where you have that clot go through there, and then it starves the heart muscle, and the muscles in the heart then stop contracting, and that's what the heart attack is. If it gets into the brain, then you have a stroke. You basically have cells dying off because they're not getting the oxygen they need from the circulatory system. So that's the big issues that we have here in the heart diseases. Okay, so real quickly in summary, the circulatory system, we talked about the heart and what it does, and it's basically just a pump that keeps the blood flowing through it. We talked about the blood vessels, which are the passageway through the body that the blood flows, and then we talked about the blood and its components itself. And we talked about what the circulatory's main purpose is, and that's to transport gases and nutrients throughout the body, and it also helps carry away the waste materials. So when we're talking about transporting gases, it's taking oxygen to the cells for cellular respiration and bringing the carbon dioxide back. It also how we get nutrients to various parts of the body. So that's it for our video. As always, good luck on the lessons, and we'll see you in the next video.